Imagine you're cooking dinner for 200 people and your refrigerator is a stone wall. That was the reality for every castle kitchen worker in medieval Europe. No electricity, no ice, no way to keep meat cold overnight, and yet the kitchens kept running, the feasts kept coming, and somehow people mostly didn't die from it. How a group of cooks with no modern tools fed enormous households every single day reveals a system so smart it's almost embarrassing that we forgot it. This is the story of medieval castle kitchens, what they actually looked like, how they actually worked, and the specific tricks that kept hundreds of people fed in a world where the wrong decision at dinner could kill you just as fast as a sword. To understand the pressure these kitchens were under, you have to understand what they were feeding. A medieval castle wasn't just a lord and his family. By the 13th century, a large English noble household could include hundreds of people: knights, squires, servants, grooms, guards, chaplains, laundresses, stable hands. The kitchen staff alone at a major castle could number 30 or 40 people working in rotating shifts, with junior staff sleeping on the kitchen floor some nights to tend fires that couldn't be allowed to go out. And all of them had to eat every single day. The head of this operation was called the master cook, and the job was part chef, part military logistics officer. Because feeding a castle wasn't just about cooking, it was about supply chains, preservation, timing, and a very clear-eyed understanding that if the food ran out or made people sick, you had a serious problem on your hands. The kind of problem that could end your career or, in extreme cases, end considerably more than that. So, let's start with the most obvious question. If there was no refrigeration, what happened to the meat? The answer is that medieval cooks barely thought about fresh meat the way we do. Fresh was great when you could get it, but it was never the plan. The plan was preservation, and they had gotten remarkably good at it over centuries of trial and error that nobody bothered to write down because everyone already knew. Salt was the backbone of the entire system. Animals were slaughtered in bulk during autumn when they were at their fattest, and the meat was packed in salt almost immediately. Not sprinkled with salt, buried in it. A barrel of salted beef could last months if stored in a cool cellar. Pork was especially well suited to salt curing, and many castles kept enormous quantities of salted pork as their primary protein supply through the winter. The salt didn't just slow bacterial growth. It changed the texture of the meat in ways that cooks learned to work with over time, soaking the saltier cuts overnight in fresh water before cooking, adjusting recipes for the stronger, deeper flavor that emerged from the brine. Smoking was the second major technique. Smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth, and hanging meat in the rafters above a constantly burning fire accomplished two things at once. It preserved the meat, and it kept it warm and dry since moisture was the real enemy. Castle kitchens often had dedicated smoking chambers or used the upper reaches of the main cooking hearth itself, where heat and smoke collected naturally without any additional effort from the kitchen staff. The third technique was fat. Sealing cooked meat in lard created an anaerobic environment where bacteria couldn't survive. This was especially common with game birds and fish. You'd confit the meat, cooking it slowly in its own fat, then seal it under a layer of solidified lard in a clay pot. If stored correctly in a cool cellar, these pots could last for weeks without spoiling. It's the same principle behind duck confit today, which is still served in French restaurants not because chefs lack refrigerators, but because the method produces a flavor and texture that refrigeration alone can't match. But here's where it gets interesting. Salt, smoke, and fat were old news by the high medieval period. What castle kitchens had really mastered was the art of the spice. There's a persistent myth that people in the Middle Ages used heavy spices to cover up rotten meat. Historians have largely put that idea to rest. Spices were extraordinarily expensive, with pepper and ginger and cloves imported at great cost along trade routes that stretched from England all the way to the East Indies. Nobody was wasting those on spoiled food they would have just thrown out or fed to the pigs. What spices were actually doing was twofold. First, some of them genuinely do have antimicrobial properties, cloves and cinnamon especially. Second, and more importantly, heavy spicing was a status symbol. The more aggressively spiced your food, the wealthier your household appeared to anyone sitting at your table. Using expensive imported spices on perfectly good meat was a way of announcing to every guest that you could afford to. This means that the elaborate spice sauces you see in medieval recipe collections weren't about hiding bad smells. They were about showing off. The food wasn't rotten. The spices were bragging. Now, all of this preserved food had to be stored somewhere, and the design of the castle itself was part of the preservation system. Cellars and undercrofts, the below-ground storage rooms built into castle foundations, stayed at a relatively stable, cool temperature year-round. Not cold by modern refrigerator standards, but cool enough to slow spoilage significantly and consistently. Castles in northern Europe had a natural advantage here. A stone undercroft in England or northern France in January wasn't far from genuinely cold, and the thick stone walls held that temperature even when fires burned above. Dry goods like grain, dried legumes, dried fruit, and smoked fish were stored separately from fresh produce, which was kept in ventilated but sheltered areas. The organisation of medieval storage was surprisingly systematic. Different rooms for different categories of food, with the most precious items under lock and key, and one person accountable for each category. The pantry, which we now think of as just a cupboard, gets its name from the Latin for bread because it was specifically the locked room where bread and dry goods were kept under the supervision of a dedicated household officer called the pantler. The buttery was the room for butts, which were large barrels, usually of ale or wine, managed by the butler. These weren't just organisational quirks, they were loss prevention systems. In a world where food was expensive and theft was constant, you locked everything valuable and made specific people answerable for every category. If something went missing from the buttery, you knew exactly whose door to knock on. Water is something most people don't think about when they imagine medieval kitchens, but it was one of the biggest logistical challenges of the whole operation. Castle kitchens needed enormous quantities of it, for boiling, for washing, for cleaning equipment, for brewing ale, which was consumed in large quantities partly because it was safer than untreated water. And unlike food, you couldn't just import water from somewhere else. Most castles were built near fresh water sources deliberately, and many had wells dug within the inner walls specifically so the kitchen and the garrison could function during a siege. The well was a survival asset as much as any fortification, but getting water from the well to the kitchen, heating it, using it, and disposing of wastewater was a massive volume of physical labour that required dedicated staff working constantly throughout the day. Here's something that surprises most people. Medieval castle kitchens often had remarkably sophisticated drainage systems. Stone channels cut into the kitchen floor directed wastewater and runoff toward drains that led outside the walls. The kitchens at the Tower of London, at Dover Castle, at Caernarfon in Wales, all show evidence of deliberate drainage planning built into the original construction. Sanitation wasn't ignored, it was just handled with stone and gravity instead of pipes and pumps, and it worked well enough that large households could operate for years without the kind of mass food poisoning events you might expect. If you've ever stood in a kitchen with multiple burners going at once and felt the heat build, multiply that by a factor of about 10 and you're getting close to what a medieval castle kitchen felt like during a feast day. The primary cooking technology was fire, and it was everywhere. The main hearth in a large castle kitchen could be big enough to roast an entire ox without modification. Spits were turned manually, sometimes by kitchen boys, and in later periods by small dogs running inside wheel mechanisms connected to the spit by a chain. That last part is not a joke. Turnspit dogs were a recognised working breed, short-legged and long-bodied, specifically bred for running inside the wheel. The job was exhausting and extremely hot, and the dogs were apparently rotated out in pairs and given breaks, which means medieval kitchen managers understood enough about labour to extend basic rest periods even to the dogs. Multiple fires ran simultaneously for different cooking tasks. Boiling pots hung over one fire, roasting happened at another. Baking was done in separate bread ovens built into the walls or in a dedicated bakehouse outside, because bread ovens run at a different temperature than roasting fires, and the risk of fire spreading between buildings was taken seriously. Not seriously enough to prevent disasters, but seriously enough to design around them. Fire was the central danger of castle kitchen operations. Many royal and noble households kept their main kitchen in a separate building from the Great Hall for exactly this reason. The walk between the kitchen and the hall might mean food arrived slightly cooler, but it meant a kitchen fire was less likely to burn down the residence. This happened anyway regularly. Windsor Castle's medieval kitchen burned. The Palace of Westminster's kitchen burned multiple times. Fire was essentially a tax that castle operators paid on the act of cooking at scale, and everyone understood it was eventually coming. We cover stories like this every week. If you like going deeper than the surface-level version, subscribe. That's what we do here. Now, the single most impressive thing about how medieval castle kitchens manage food supply isn't any one technique. It's the system underneath all of them. Think about what a major feast required in an era before refrigeration. A royal feast in England in the 14th century might call for hundreds of dishes across multiple courses, serving anywhere from a few dozen guests to several hundred. You couldn't source ingredients the day before. You couldn't correct a supply shortage with a quick order. Everything had to be planned weeks or months in advance, stored correctly, and prepared with zero ability to recover quickly from mistakes. What medieval great households developed instead was a supply chain model that would look familiar to any modern logistics manager, just executed with horses and barrels instead of trucks and cold storage. Animals were bought on the hoof and walked to the castle, which kept them fresh because they were alive. This sounds primitive, but it's actually elegant. You're not transporting perishable meat. You're transporting a living food reserve and converting it at the moment you need it. Fish ponds, called stew ponds, were maintained within or near the castle grounds specifically to provide fresh fish on demand, since fish spoiled faster than almost anything else and couldn't be walked to you alive over long distances. A well-stocked stew pond meant fresh fish whenever the household needed it, without any preservation involved at all. Dovecotes housing hundreds of doves provided a consistent and renewable source of fresh meat at a scale that seems almost industrial in retrospect. A well-maintained dovecote could produce dozens of birds per week throughout the year, providing reliable fresh protein even in winter when preserved goods dominated every other category. The birds fed themselves by foraging and required minimal management compared to cattle or pigs. Forests and hunting grounds attached to noble estates weren't purely recreational. They were managed protein reserves operating on a schedule. Deer parks were large enclosures where deer were kept semi-wild and hunted on a rotation, providing fresh venison when the household needed it, rather than when a random hunt succeeded. This was controlled access to live food storage, just executed at landscape scale and dressed up in the language of sport. The kitchen garden attached to a castle provided herbs, vegetables, and some fruit, but it was never the primary food source for a large household. It was supplementary. The real supply chain was preserved goods moving in from storage, live animals being processed to order, and the strategic timing of slaughter calibrated to what the cellar could hold and what the winter would demand. And the timing was everything. Autumn slaughter, called Martinmas after the Feast of St. Martin on November 11th, was the single most consequential moment in the castle's food calendar. It was when the household converted its livestock surplus into the preserved goods that would carry everyone through winter. Too many animals slaughtered meant waste if storage capacity was exceeded before everything could be properly preserved. Too few meant food shortages by February, when fresh supply was nearly impossible and the preserved stores had already been drawn down for months. Getting this calculation right, knowing exactly how many barrels of salt pork and smoked fish the household needed to reach spring, was the master cook's most important annual decision, and one that couldn't be undone once made. What makes all of this remarkable is how little margin for error existed, and how rarely catastrophic failures occurred in well-run households. We have records of famines, of sieges that starved out garrisons, of terrible harvests. but the picture that emerges from household accounts, from recipe collections, from the inventory records that survive from major English and French noble households, is of kitchens that mostly worked, supply systems that mostly delivered. Food that, despite no refrigeration and no modern sanitation understanding, mostly didn't kill the people eating it. The master cook who kept 200 people fed through a northern European winter without refrigeration, without thermometers, without germ theory, without any of the conceptual tools we'd consider basic, wasn't doing something primitive. He was doing something sophisticated under severe constraints. And the sophistication is visible in how long the system held. These methods didn't become obsolete when refrigeration arrived. Salt-cured ham, smoked fish, confit duck, aged cheese. These are still considered delicacies today, not because we lack refrigerators, but because the old methods produced flavors and textures that cold storage alone can't replicate. The medieval kitchen accidentally invented a range of foods that outlasted everything else about the medieval world. The turnspit dog is extinct. The spitboy job is gone. The dovecote is a garden ornament. But the logic of the medieval kitchen: source carefully, preserve aggressively. Waste nothing, time everything, design the building around the work rather than the other way around. That logic didn't disappear. It scaled up and moved into supply chains and cold storage facilities, so large you can't see them from the road. The principles survived even when the stone walls didn't. The castle is gone, but the kitchen is everywhere. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.